Good morning, everybody. Well, we're very happy that we're starting almost on time, which is fantastic. Welcome to the conference after the Deluge, and odd as it is, we thought that the word after would be, we would be past it now, and it turns out we're not, and we're still in the middle of, we're not even sure which wave. The fourth wave, fifth wave, and so we have lots to talk about. And I'm sitting here with, first of all, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Mark Reinert, from, and I'm going to pass him the microphone here soon, and then Mark can talk for himself, from the University of Stockholm, all the way from Stockholm. I'm going to mention to everybody that we have an extensive staff here that you will probably not see, but in the background, our professional staff. Brian, Henry, Katrina, Will, and Edward, all working here to make sure that we're recorded and people can tune in from far away, which is saving us. So this was our contingency plan. We'll make it a hybrid conference, and thank God we did. And our idea was when we thought about this conference, to take lessons from COVID-19, because one could say this is the natural experiment, and I've already read that some people have things to say about what an experiment is, but we can still say it. This is a natural experiment that many countries have had to run, and several times. So very interesting material to see what the lessons are from this crisis, ongoing. And it fits into a larger project on creeping crisis. And when COVID-19 came out, we were already working on that project, and we said, this is just a perfect example of a creeping crisis. It's also the perfect example of a protracted crisis now, the crisis that won't go away, but that's not how we conceived of it. So maybe Mark and I and Magnus Ekengren, back in Sweden, who just became a father and could not be with us, here physically at least. And maybe, Mark, you can tell us a little bit more about the project and what we're trying to achieve and how this fits in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Arjen. It's nice to be here and to see everybody physically and virtually. Indeed, as Arjen said, we have been making an effort to try to encourage a rethink of what crises means, away from traditional definitions, and a rethink of what crisis management therefore means, the ways we might organize for crisis management at the political, strategic level especially. And what we're trying to bring attention to is, I think, what we're all seeing, which is that crises today don't follow the same kind of patterns that traditional crises do, where there's a clear beginning and end, there's a moment of decision making that has to happen quickly under conditions of urgency and uncertainty. Today's crises, as we're going to talk about today, rethink how it affects how we study them, how we organize for them, have much longer gestation periods. They evolve over time through interacting different kinds of factors. They reveal themselves sometimes in what we call precursor events or foreshadowing events. So you might see a particular crisis, but in some respects, that's not the crisis per se. That's an indicator of an underlying problem that's unfolding. And then we have varying degrees of attention from different groups in society, scientists, politicians, NGOs, and of course we have inadequate responses as well. So that's the way we kind of define and that we conceptualize the creeping crisis. And again, in many respects it casts into doubt all the ways that we've been studying crisis and the way we've been thinking about what societies have to do to mobilize and to organize in order to keep them at bay. So creeping crisis encourages us to rethink how we think about crisis, how we think about organizing for crisis management. And when we think about organizing, all of the different themes of the workshops come into view here. So we start with discussions of detection, we move on to discussions of communicating to the public what's happening, what their role in this is. And all the way down the line to what responses should look like, decision-making processes, the role of experts, legitimacy effects of creeping crises. So it's going to be a wonderful few days. We're very much grateful to the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, who have been very generous and in many respects showed their foresightedness by developing the creeping crisis concept within their own house, within their own agency, and encouraging researchers to help them explore what that means and how they can do their job better. So we're very grateful for them. Again, we give a nod to Magnus, our absent colleague who's back at home, and we look forward to the events of today.
Thank you, Mark. So let me just say a few words about how we're running this conference, because this is not your average conference. I can tell by our panelists are already slight panic is creeping in, and so our idea was as COVID made us all rethink how we teach and how we communicate, and almost took away the whole idea of the conventional conference. It would be all coming together at this massive event. To rethink how we can do this smartly. So we had set it up from the very beginning as a hybrid event, offering our participants the opportunity to stay at home. So the good thing is nobody had to cancel. And we're literally going to have almost a 50-50% people here in the panels, people at home. And the aim of the conference is really to have a good conversation focused on the theme at hand. So we identified 10 themes that we think are all important and relevant. We thought about who should be in the panel and had something to say from varying backgrounds. And we're going to try to pull out, the lessons that we can get from our esteemed panelists. And we're going to invite people who happen to be with us, who registered online, and if they want to contribute, ask a question, they're very welcome to. The chat will be monitored. The people here who are with us are, of course, also very welcome to contribute and participate. We have Katrina. Where is Katrina? Katrina, can you just stand and Katrina loves the microphone, so she'll be happily walking around with the microphone to give you a chance to ask a question. So those are the ground rules, then I think we can start with our first panel. First panel is about detecting a creeping crisis, and I think if COVID has taught us one thing, is that detection apparently is a lot harder than we thought. And one could say that it was forgivable that you missed the first wave. It becomes slightly more disconcerting that we seem to be missing the third and the fourth and all those waves. So there are some real questions to be asked about how can we recognize crisis? Do we even want to recognize crisis? Maybe that's the question. And we have 4 very exciting panelists. We have, in order of appearance, shall we say. Let me briefly introduce them. Roos van der Haer, and my colleague at Leiden University, who is an expert in, the causes and consequences of child soldiering, recruitment strategies of rebel groups, and psychological causes of conflict participation, among other things, but in short, in conflict studies, and has extensive empirical experience, and has also investigated, early warning. Can we predict conflicts? And it turns out that there's a large body of work on the prediction of conflicts. And of course, that makes us curious. Can we predict, foresee other types of crisis? So that would be, I think, is going to be a great kickoff. And Roos has produced a very nice memo summarizing that research. So I would encourage you to have a look at that if you find this interesting. And then we'll go to King's College in London, and we're going to talk to Christoph Meyer. And he's a full professor of European and international politics at King's College. And he's done many, many things. We'll get to talk about it, but very interestingly, he focuses on why intelligence does or does not reach decision makers. And he'll have many things to say about that. And so it builds very nicely on Roos's topic. Then we're going to go back to the table. No, we're not. We're going to Jordan. I'm sorry, Sarah. We're going to Dr. Alshoubaki, and she is an assistant professor at the University of Jordan. And I should mention that Dr. Alshoubaki really wanted to be with us here in Leiden, but due to the infinite knowledge and wisdom of our embassy in Amman, was not even granted an interview. So that's then how harsh our immigration politics work and interfere with at least coming together here. But I'm very, very glad that that you're joining us in the virtual world. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And finally, then we're gonna go to, we practice this, and so Sarah Pralle, did I say it right? Yeah. Sarah Pralle from Syracuse University, all the way from Syracuse University, and Mark and I have long ties with Syracuse, so we're super happy to have you with us. And Sarah's an associate professor of political science at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and always #1 public administration, political science in the United States, super school. And I've been using her work for a long time in my policy class, because Sarah is an expert on attention. And I think what this is all going to is, we're talking about the attention of policymakers. Why are they not paying attention? This weekend, the climate conference is going to open in Glasgow. And speaking of attention, and Sarah has a background in environmental politics, and talked about the good old days with Greenpeace. So we'll get to talk about all that. So attention is, so we're moving from data almost and software systems to then producing reports, and then to the receiving end, the attention. And Mark and I have been wrestling with that. And Mark, you've done work on attention and policy stuff in your days, early days. So this should be super interesting. We asked everybody to start with a brief introduction just to get the conversation going. So we don't want the classic, PowerPoint by death kind of presentations, and endless killing our time. We want a conversation. So we asked for a brief introduction, sort of a statement. So this is what I think, and Roos, so you're going to kick it off today, and a question to the we're going to be experimenting a little bit, trying to get it exactly right. So should I shut this off now when they talk, or no? Oh, no, that's no. So I'm going to give the floor to Roos.
Thank you, Arjen. I hope this is okay with the sound. Yeah? All right. So thank you very much for having me here. I was asked to give you a short statement, 5 to 7 minutes, I got the instruction, about the main lessons and the main challenges. And as Arjen already said, I'm a conflict scholar, so I'm interested in predicting armed conflict. And I think inherently all armed conflict researchers, we are deep down inside really into prediction of conflict, because if we can predict a conflict, we might be able to prevent it. But most of the conflict scholars, most of the field are primarily interested in explanations, but more and more we are interested in predicting. And in discussing the main lessons and the main challenges, I want to give you a tiny bit of overview what kinds of or types of conflict predictions my field is recognizing. And I think in general we can recognize 3 types of predictions. And the first type is basically a prediction by experts. So those people that you see at the CNN and BBC, they give you a prediction of where conflict might occur or which conflicts might escalate. And these are experts have insight knowledge on what is going on the ground. However, in the scholarly, in the academic field, These predictions made by these informative scholars and experts are not always very respected, because studies have shown is that some of those predictions are not as good as we think they are. It's sometimes even better to randomly toss a coin. So more and more academic scholars are using the insights of these scholars and these experts to come up with different predictions to use in their so-called statistical models. The second prediction, or the second type of forecast that we know in my field, are done by scholars interested in game theory. Yeah, so rational choice models, formal models, in which they vary with economic models and formal ways of defining preferences and utilities, etc. They come up with predictions on how particular actors in conflict will act. There are some successes with this, so there are some famous scholars that gained a lot of success with correcting predicting. But all in all, we can say that these kind of models have a bit of a mixed results. And it has partly to do with the fact that we make gigantic assumptions about what state actors or what rebel groups prefer. And of course, we don't know that always. So we make gigantic assumptions, and if these assumptions are wrong, these models might also be wrong. Largely, and that is what we currently see most of the time in the academic field, is a focus on statistical models, yeah, structural models predicting armed conflict. And what these models basically do, we gather a lot of data, put it in very complicated statistical models, and we use a lot of computer power, and then in the hope that something comes out. And we started doing this in the 60s, 70s, yeah, where we started collecting empirical systematic data, and currently these models are performing relatively well. So initially we started with models with entering what we call structural variables, so we enter variables like measuring the level of democracy of a country, or we measure GDP levels, etc. But of course these structural variables, these large variables measuring these large things, are not changing so much, so they were not very good in predicting conflict. What we do currently see more and more scholars is looking for much more disaggregated data, so very precise data, as much as we can find. So what we do see, for instance, is scholars focusing on event data, so all information about one little tiny event happening. So which actors are involved, how many people were killed, was it close to natural resources, or was it close to a mine? And all these little information we enter in these models. And we see that these models are performing pretty well, to be honest. And they are performing well in a few ways. We can relatively well predict on this moment, predict the onset, so the occurrence of armed conflict in the short run. So we can say in 2 or 3 years we predict that this particular area there's likely to be a conflict. Yeah, this we can do. Short run conflict prediction we can relatively. What we also can do relatively well is predicting escalation. So if we have a conflict already there with a low level of violence, what we can do is predict relatively well when this turns into high levels of violence. Yeah. But there are a lot of things that we cannot do yet, or that we are not so good in. And one of the things where we are not so good is predicting the onset, so the occurrence of armed conflict, a low level of armed conflict. So in a country where, or an area where there was no conflict, why is this particular area suddenly a low level of conflict? We cannot do this kind of thing. We have problems doing this. What we also are very bad in on this moment, and bad is relatively, it is not bashing my entire field, but we are relatively not very good in determining the spread of conflict. So why do certain conflicts spread across borders? Yeah, this we are not really good in. Lastly, which is where we're also not fantastic good in, is estimating the effect of little events that might cause a gigantic effect. So think about the Arab Spring. It started with a man in Tunisia that set himself on fire, and basically whole North Africa and the Middle East were suddenly into one big gigantic revolution. These little events and how this might impact larger occurrences, we are not so good in. Yeah, we could not predict the Arab Spring, for instance. No one could, at least not in my field. So this is basically the main lessons. Yeah, we know now what we are good at, what we are not so good at. And I see, and there are of course many challenges. And I can come up with two major challenges. And one is a bit of what I call a bit of a vague challenge. And that is the fact that the field of international relations and the field of armed conflict is very messy. In the sense that a lot of actors are moving, some actors are withholding information that you actually want to have, and basically armed conflict most of the time occurs when people do not behave like we think that they behave. So if they behave badly or so, or not according to the rules. And this is of course a bit of a messy process, and there are certain scholars that say, yeah, this makes it very, very difficult to predict conflict in general. Yeah, it's just because of the international system, it's just one big gigantic mess. The second, and that is more practically, and that is the problem of measurement. So what we do now see with structural models of conflict prediction is that the more data we get into, the better our models become. But the data, the models are only as good as the data that we put into it. So if the data that we put into it is bad, then the models or the prediction that we have is also not fantastic. And we rely heavily on secondary sources. So we rely on local newspapers, international newspapers that gives us information on particular events before the conflict takes place, or maybe also during the conflict. And you can imagine that not everything is in these newspapers. These newspapers might be biased, or not everything is picked up by journalists, and that biases also our results. What we generally see on this moment, and that is also a tiny bit of a challenge, is this reliance on social media. Yeah, on one hand, we can imagine that social media will increase the amount of data that we have. We have now currently real-life data. We can look at tweets coming up, and we say, oh, okay, there is something happening in the north of Kenya. This might influence conflict prediction. Yeah? So in that sense, Twitter, social media, Facebook might increase our conflict prediction success, basically. However, the use of social media, although it might help us, causes also a lot of problems. And we all know that. There's a lot of false information on social media. We know that not everyone has Twitter. It's always the rich people that have Twitter, or Twitter, those people that are in urban areas, although we know that most conflict takes place in rural areas. So it's a lot of bias. So we're currently struggling with not only measurement of existing data sources, but also what to do with these social media thing. And I think although our field we are moving slowly. Yeah? Conflict prediction is a very slow-moving field. It's not like that we have gigantic successes from one day to another. But I think especially the scholars that are working in this field are acknowledging that we are moving slow, and are acknowledging that also getting a high level of success is difficult. But what they are currently doing is basically testing the limits of existing models. We are basically, can we predict in 20 or 30 years, and what can we do and what can we not do? And that is just a constant testing of our existing knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, that's a very powerful introduction to a field that most people, I don't think, have grips on. I'm hearing about the death of the expert. And I'm sure we'll get to talk more about that. And apparently some really good successes based on fairly scarce data, which begs the question, why we can't do better with COVID. But we'll get back to all that. Thank you so much, Roos. Let's move on to for an opening statement to London, and Christoph Meyer. We'd like to give you the floor. Good morning, and thank you for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much. So I think the first lesson that I think I've learned from my studies of warnings and responses to warnings, mainly in the area of conflict, mass atrocities and interstate war, is really that the issue of detection of a crisis or forecasting is not just a problem of accuracy of forecasting to the satisfaction of experts. It's not just a technocratic problem, but it is also, and perhaps more so, a question of how do you reach the recipients? How do you ensure that decision makers actually trust the forecasts, that they find forecasts useful and actionable, that the information that is provided is something that they can use to formulate preventive or mitigating responses, that they trust the messenger, and that there is that problems of political receptivity are being overcome, and that there are actually instruments available that could be activated in the right lead time. So I think one of the key messages is that this is not a completely distinct problem, but the key issues that affect all the other issues of decision making and so forth and communication already come in and need to be considered at the, I suppose, forecasting stage. Crisis detection needs to be built back to front. It needs to start from the response side in order to be really useful. So I think that's the first point I'd like to make. In my paper, I'm kind of distinguishing three, I suppose, distinct areas of why crises are not being detected. And I just name them because I think it might be a useful tool for understanding the difference between the challenges. The first is that the potential crisis indications, the evidence, the data is not being monitored at all by governments or international organizations. The second is that they may be monitored in principle, but organizations fail to pick up those crisis indications or fail to bring them together in an integrated and comprehensive way. And the last bit is that the indications are monitored, but that governments and international organizations lack a theory of negative change. So they can't interpret, they can't make sense of those data in a way that allows them to accurately forecast. And I think each of these, I suppose, challenges or failures can have different causes. So coming to the first, why are indications not monitored? I think the notion of blind spots is very helpful. And I know there's already some good research on organizational blind spots, why organizations leave aside certain types of risks. But I think we should also look at cultural and methodological or technological blind spots that help perhaps to explain why risks to certain communities are being overlooked. I mean, I think in one of the books there was the issue of the NSU killings in Germany or some kind of health risk particular to women. We see in COVID-19 some communities are much more affected than others, so that in a sense crisis to certain communities are not even perceived as crisis because we're not monitoring the risks to them. Yeah, so I think that the notion of blind spots is very useful there, and how organizations can see they're not seeing, how they can challenge themselves to see better and to see which are the blind spots are critical that they actually need to look at. The second causes for the second type of problem, namely the monitoring but not the bringing together quickly, is I think a mixture of inaccessibility, and we heard already from the previous speaker about rural countries, the risk to what is happening in rural countries not picked up. But I think what is also useful is secrecy and deception. And I think we should not ignore that. Even with the pandemic, we had an issue of secrecy, namely of regional authorities in China, who were seeking to suppress some of the information first. So it's not just about hostile actors and terrorists and the Russian GRU who wants to surprise us. Sometimes it's even in other areas where you see deception and secrecy. So that is a problem. And then we have the problem of silos that I think is well understood in the literature, that with a financial crisis, banks had the data, but they didn't see the risk to the overall institution. And then finally, why is it that we lack a theory of change? I think sometimes it's because we've forgotten, or states have forgotten lessons from previous crises, or they fail to learn from crises in other countries. And I think in the pandemic, we clearly see that Western governments have not learned from East Asian experiences of previous pandemics. But I think it's even more fundamental than that. I think we need to understand that having a theory of negative change in crisis is very disruptive for bureaucracies and for policymakers. So it is not a coincidence that organizations do not have a theory of change, because it is very costly. It shows them that maybe policies are not working, maybe that policies are even contributing to the crisis. So I think we do need to take resistance to worst case thinking within bureaucracies, within governments very, very seriously, and think about how do we overcome that? Is that through depoliticization, or is that through new forms of advocacy? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a very precise statement. Thank you. And obviously many questions come to mind. So but we're going to hold on to those. And first we're going to go to Jordan. And Dr. Alshoubaki, welcome.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone from Jordan. I'm so happy to be with you, at least virtually. I will take you on the discussion or on some point of detecting a creeping crisis, but from Jordan's response to the pandemic in particular. Because my research focuses on this period of time on the pandemic and all the complexity of response. Mainly when if you had the chance just to very quickly look to the memo that we provided, when I look to the Jordanian government phases in responding to the pandemic, what comes to my mind at the beginning, the panic phase and isolation phase was very clear during the beginning of the crisis and how the government responds. So I was trying to understand, it's coming from maybe surprise management approach and everything happened without, it's like a more surprising thing. But then I just make a very quick look to the incubation phase of dealing with the crisis and all that stuff. So I found that Jordan literally delayed the response in somehow. So creeping crisis happens sometimes due to some political or misinterpretation indicators from government, from policymakers, and so on. So I was asking myself and just went to the Jordanian government response, what are the drivers, or why does the Jordanian government delay its response from, for example, the incubation phase from December 31 until March 16, just to respond or to make some restriction, except Jordanian government evacuation for students from Wuhan, nothing has occurred in that period. So I just was thinking about the political and social driver. I tried to address this stuff from more political lens. I analyzed the Jordanian national mood, the political attitudes of the Jordanian government. I found that we have too many drivers that make us think about like biomedical hazard was occurring in China is far from us geographically. We are tackling more like different kind of a crisis here in Jordan. For example, Jordan is a Middle Eastern country, so we are dealing with civil unrest on neighboring states. We're receiving refugees, Syrian refugees, other refugees from different countries such as Libya, Somalia, and so on. We hosted around 1 million of Syrian refugees. Only 600,000 of them are registered by UNHCR. So Jordan government took this in consider while dealing to different kind of a crisis. So that was the first priority. We have other priorities like unemployment rates is very high and it's really alarming. Also, we have like a high degree of inflation rate. We have different kind of issues that the government is trying to focus on. And even I analyzed the national mood of Jordanians. It's like the focus was looking for better job opportunity, dealing with the anti-corruption file in Jordan, dealing with different kind of developmental issues. So the governmental, even I analyzed also the agenda of government. I found it's like we are trying to deal with water shortage, energy problems, refugees issues, and all that stuff. So that's make us as a government think about, okay, dealing with the biomedical hazard thing, it may be far from us, especially like Ebola, like AIDS and all that stuff. We don't impacted harshly with it. So that was the priorities of government and the national mood, which can consider like put us on a different situation and hard situation during like the fluctuation on the waves we have. We suffered from three very harsh waves of the pandemic. So it reveals that in somehow the Jordanian government tried to manage the crisis, but it's not on the very early stages. So what very quickly come to my mind by some remarks and recommendation for this. The problem lies, I feel like, the delay on dealing with the crisis and identify most of crisis as a creeping the crisis. Why? Because due to the influence of social and political structure of policymakers, sometimes they misinterpret the crisis indicator, and sometimes they feel like underestimated. So we need to make the indicators of any kind of a crisis, if it's inside or outside, with more serious. We need to interpret it by using a panel of experts. We need them to use more information, to rely information. I'm talking particularly in Jordan. Also, we need to recall the idea of employing anticipation strategy and resilience strategy together. Some countries focus on resilience. Okay, and we need to deal with to building capacity to deal with the current crisis, especially in Jordan. All the time we're talking about we're gonna deal with the refugees crisis, water shortage crisis, energy crisis. But what about, we need to also to exert some efforts on anticipation strategies also, and anticipate some new kind of crisis. Also, what I found is like during the analysis of pandemic from the creeping crisis concept, I feel like there is a declining or inability of the global system to address the worldwide problems. I feel like the pandemic raised the nationalism, and really we need to revitalize the global commitment to dealing with the crisis, and consider the global commitment to crisis, to issues. It's like part of our national agenda. Otherwise, we are not gonna sustain or to build a strong capacity during dealing with any kind of crisis. So these are main points for dealing with the crisis and for detecting a crisis or in Jordan. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I lived in Louisiana, and people in Louisiana prided themselves saying, you know, this is a laboratory for disaster if you live here. But I think Jordan can put some competition on that list. And the question that you're putting on the agenda is, you know, how do you recognize something so insignificant as a little pandemic when you're dealing with all these existential crises? And I would almost say, you know, it's forgivable if you missed the first week. But we're getting to the point of attention here. So why do politicians pay attention to certain problems and not to other problems? And this is a classic question in political science and in the policy study, so we're super happy to have Sarah with us. And she happens to be an expert on precisely this question. So lead us into this, the world of attention, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Arhen and Mark, for organizing this workshop, and for all the staff who's been working behind the scenes. So as Arhen said, I'm a scholar of agenda setting, and most of my remarks today will be with climate change as the creeping crisis in the background, since that's what I study. And so creeping crises like climate change or other slow-moving kind of chronic problems obviously pose kind of particular challenges when it comes to attention allocation. And in fact, one of the key characteristics of creeping crises, according to those who coined the term, is the real absence of meaningful attention to a crisis. And I presume at the earlier stages of a crisis, but also possibly at other periods as well. And when issues are not noticed, as scholars of agenda setting have reminded us, you know, political actors don't develop preferences to deal with them. The public doesn't care about them. Interest groups don't bother with them. Solutions are not really formulated, and political pressure does not mount, and no decision is really made. So the stakes are really high, especially for creeping crises, because In these kinds of slow-moving crises, our failure to intervene early or in a timely manner prolongs that crisis and can, as others have noticed, and may complicate subsequent efforts to mitigate the problem. And I think that's largely due to sort of the path dependency of some of our decisions. It gets harder and harder to sort of solve those problems down the road because the economic, social, and political costs tend to rise. And the way I think about this is in regards to my own research, I'm looking at flooding issues. And one of the difficulties in the United States is that a lot of coastal communities and riverine communities have kind of ignored this problem for quite a while. And in fact, development is increasing in these areas rather than decreasing. And so those who want to reverse that trend are coming up against some really big challenges because there's more and more people now who live in these risky areas. And the aggregate value of that real estate is quite high. So how do these homeowners then react to policies that are going to try to increase the cost of living in these areas in order to get them to move out? How do local elected officials who rely on the property taxes generated by this real estate react if we're trying to create policies to move them out? If retreat is the best option, which it is probably in many areas, how much is the taxpayer willing to spend to buy out these homeowners? And by failing to pay serious attention to these issues earlier, those challenges are just larger because of the size of this population that lives there and the value, of that real estate. So in my opening remarks, I have sort of two things I'd like to do. One is a way, sort of offering a way to think more, in a more nuanced fashion, perhaps, about attention. And I realized after I wrote this that it's kind of reminiscent of Anthony Downs' issue attention cycle, but I'm trying to apply it a little bit more to slow-moving crises. And then the second point I'd like to make is that I'd like to propose that policies themselves can focus attention on crises, but not always in ways that are very helpful. And I'm going to draw on my own research on flood mapping to illustrate that. So I have in my opening remarks that I submitted a kind of three-stage approach to attention in creeping crises. And this is, this stuff is probably familiar to a lot of you. And I don't think issues necessarily move through these as a stage. And they don't have to move at all. So the stage metaphor is just a metaphor, really. So the first is just straight out attention to these precursor events. Christoph mentioned that sometimes there's actually no attention to these kind of small precursor events because no one's really monitoring them. And so that might even be a stage before this. But let's say there are some precursor events. At this kind of stage, the attention is sort of minimal and minimized. And the sort of recognition is that in slow-moving crises, these precursor events are sort of underappreciated, and the indicators are not really rising to the top of people's radar, so to speak. And there's little guarantee outside of maybe experts that anyone's going to frame the issue as a crisis to begin with. Maybe people don't have enough knowledge about the crisis to understand what counts as an indicator or a precursor event, and a lot of uncertainty probably exists around it as well. Experts may be tracking indicators, but they fail to communicate to policymakers and the public the connection between these events and the underlying crisis. And experts probably are hesitant to do so as well, given the uncertainty. They don't really want to put themselves out there. And there's lots of other reasons for ignoring warning signs besides a lack of knowledge. Others have pointed out that the events might be geographically and sort of psychologically distant from people and not really register as a threat. The events might be small disruptions that are not focal enough to gain attention. Groups and organizations with a stake in solving the crisis may not be really organized or very powerful and fail in their efforts to raise awareness. If the events are harmful, the public may be reassured that the government can handle the problem, particularly in the early stages when presumably it hasn't reached a full-blown crisis yet. Other events like droughts, floods, and hurricanes are always likely to get attention, at least at the local level, but the public and policymakers can dismiss those events as atypical and exceptional rather than as a warning of things to come. Or conversely, the events are seen as just kind of common and part of a natural cycle, especially when it comes to things like natural disasters. So these events garner attention, but the attention tends to be sort of narrowly focused on the event and the recovery from that event, rather than the underlying crisis like climate change. And so the most important characteristic at this stage is a lack of recognition of that slow-moving crisis. The media covers the event, if at all, in predictable ways that kind of follow a familiar narrative. Policymakers may react, but not to the underlying crisis. And the crisis just can't compete with other more pressing problems. And for this reason, the crisis should not be over-politicized, should not be over-politicized, because it's not really getting much attention, and it's not on anyone's list of priorities. The second kind of stage would be a recognition of a potential problem and a widening attention. So this is marked by sort of growing recognition that events and problem indicators may be connected in ways that constitute an underlying crisis. Some actors and institutions are going to start connecting the dots for the public and policymakers. Experts are going to feel more willing to make those connections, although they'll continue to emphasize uncertainty and ambiguity. Advocacy groups might become slightly more empowered now to campaign and look for opportunities to connect the crisis to the events themselves. The media might start to discuss the underlying crisis too after a precursor event like a hurricane or a flood, but their attention is likely to be sporadic and after the fact during this stage. So there's some research that shows, for example, that wildfire coverage in the West is increasingly connecting wildfires to climate change, but oftentimes the media is only making those connections weeks or months after the event itself, when fewer people are really paying attention to it. We can expect at this stage too that stakeholder groups are going to start feeling threatened by the increasing attention, those who are benefiting from the status quo, and they're going to resist efforts to frame it as a crisis. They're going to emphasize uncertainty, they're going to attempt to de-link the events from the crisis, and otherwise, keep this issue off the agenda. This is when policymakers could start to intervene to mitigate the crisis, but there's no guarantee that they will. And then the third stage, which some crises will never reach, I think, is awareness of the problem and a sort of routinization of attention. And this is when, there's sort of a broad acknowledgement, yes, that climate change exists, and events that were seen as unrelated are now connected to that underlying crisis. And attention might be routinized through like journalistic beats by institutions who are focused exclusively on the crisis. But the crisis could still compete with other more immediate and pressing problems, and attention is still likely to ebb and flow at this stage. Stakeholders who are threatened will continue to resist the crisis framing, but they're less prone, I think, to deny it altogether, and more likely to emphasize the difficulties and costs in addressing it. And it's important to acknowledge that this stage is not permanent. I think when crises develop slowly, the public, as Down says, becomes bored with it, or we might just live with it as a condition. It might turn back into a condition. And I think, some people are already talking about COVID that way, right? A condition that we're just gonna live with versus a problem to be solved. Attention's likely to wane if we can't find an acceptable solution, as Kingdon reminds us, and if the public thinks it's being addressed already. Okay, so that's my kind of, different ways of thinking about attention. The second point I want to make is that policies are institutions as well. And as institutions, policies can help generate attention, recognition, and awareness, all those things that I just talked about. And a lot of the agenda setting literature assumes that attention precedes policy action. So for policymakers to act, the problem must generate enough attention to get on public and governmental agendas. But I kind of want to reverse that. Policies themselves can attract attention to problems, leading to greater recognition and awareness of a creeping crisis. And the literature on policy feedback really encourages us to think of policies as institutions that have these downstream political impacts. And in his classic formulation of policy feedback, Paul Pearson identifies sort of two main feedback mechanisms. First, policies confer resources and create incentives that shape subsequent politics. And second, policies affect the flow of information and shape how people interpret the world around them. So policies designed to address problems associated with a creeping crisis may provide resources and communicate information in ways that help to bring attention to the crisis in its earlier stages or as it unfolds. Policies can channel resources to government institutions and to interest groups who then use their increased capacity and organizational strength to advocate for more attention to the crisis. The policies can also generate and routinize information and create communication channels that bring public attention to that underlying or slow-moving crisis. And just briefly, I've done some research on the politics of flood mapping in the United States, and this provides a sort of example of what I'm talking about. So in the US, in about the late 1960s, the federal government created a national flood insurance program that provides subsidized flood insurance for communities who agree to regulate development in flood zones. And this was an attempt to deal with a problem, which is there were no private insurance companies that would underwrite flooding because it was just too expensive and unpredictable. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, administers this insurance program. And they're charged with, as part of this, regularly updating flood maps upon which the decisions about insurance, development, and regulation depend. And the program in general and the mapping process, I think in particular, provide an opportunity for communities to understand their flood risk and take appropriate action to mitigate kind of future flooding. Put differently, the flood mapping process provides an opportunity to kind of have a community conversation about flood risks and maybe promote attention to the growing flood risks associated with climate change. But in practice, in my own research, I found that the NFIP doesn't really do this very well. It doesn't adequately or routinely provide that kind of information that engender those types of conversations about the crisis of climate change. And the reasons for this are a lot, and I outline them in some of my other research. But one of the biggest barriers is from the fact that the risk information about flood is channeled through an insurance policy. And really, that's what the community conversation becomes about, is about whether people have to pay insurance or not. And for a lot of homeowners, especially low-income homeowners, and that oftentimes do live in some of these risky areas, that's a bigger risk to them. The insurance, the cost of insurance is a bigger risk to them, or more immediate risk to them than the possibility of flooding. And so when you remap an area, it's all about who's in and outside of the flood zone and how much people are going to have to pay for their insurance. And so this example, I think, shows us that policy design, the way we design our policies, can either help or hinder the kind of information that flows to communities, and that the kinds of conversations that we actually have at the community level about these different risks and crises. Some policies might be designed so that they alert attention to these creeping crises, and others are sort of gonna fail to do so. And so I think a really useful area for future research would be to see how these policy designs and how they're implemented, policies are implemented, can either bring attention to these crises or not. And I think it would be useful to try to understand those attention dynamics. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, this is very interesting. Thank you. And you came from afar, so you get credit for that. So thank you so much. And you mentioned Anthony Downs, and if I remember correctly, he passed away this month. So that's nice to mention his very important work. So it's almost the politics about recognition that you're talking about, and the first common theme, and I'm sure there'll be many other that we can filter out, but the one that I'm hearing in this conversation is this idea of the precursor events. And of course, people call it differently. They talk about it differently. So Roos was talking about, we don't understand how small little events kind of escalate into big events. Well, that's Dr. Alshoubaki was talking about, indicators of something we should be looking at. And Christoph Meyer was telling us, we lack a theory of how to interpret certain events. So the precursor event, and where did that term come from? Is that Kingdom term? Is that a precursor event? I think it's from the policy literature, or well, anyway, that shouldn't detain us right now. But Barry Turner, yes. Barry Turner, thank you, Sanke. Barry Turner, always good to remember his excellent work. You can't buy that book anymore, but precursor events, and Mark and I wrestled with that, trying to define that, and so let's focus a bit on, and we're going to do that later too, because it's so interesting in terms of how you would do that. So we're looking at, Roos said, you have experts and they suck, essentially. They apparently they make gigantic assumptions, and you're better off having a monkey throw darts. If citing Tetlock's work. Okay, so that's what he pretty much shows. So, but you believe in data and big data. So Roos is a big believer in this, and so let's just as a start of the conversation, how we can move and get a handle on, and might not even be possible. So we have a political part of this conversation, because Sarah is essentially saying, some people might not want to pay attention to this. It's the same thing in Jordan. We don't really care about this problem. So we have but let's first start if we can actually recognize. Do you think, based on young and optimistic, and that there were, and we're looking at the big data revolution, and that's, there's this wonderful dream of putting all this data into models that were then going to recognize these small events that are important and that we could easily then handle because they're still small events. Is that possible?
Me being young and optimistic.
and you having the time. No.
Let's be very yes and no. I think these small, tiny events of, and I'm constantly thinking about this one event in the Arab Spring that someone set himself on fire and that blew then all over the Middle East. These little events, no, we cannot predict because it doesn't occur more often. It's just one event. If it would occur more often, we could recognize this pattern and then our models will detect it. However, I do think, a tiny bit because I'm young and optimistic, I think that there are I do think with the increase of use of social media, for instance, where we actually are aware of these little tiny events, that this increases the likelihood that we might detect them. But in general, for our big data, we need to see patterns, and if it is just one tiny event, then they are overlooked by the data. That sounds very horrible, but yes. Okay, so inherent limitations to
but you could also say we need a theory, and the complexity research people, they always seem to suggest that they have a theory in terms of how small events, the proverbial sand grain, can then trigger this whole thing of events. London calling. Such a theory. Any hope for such a theory? Sigh.
Well, yeah. Okay. I think if we want to detect some of these indications earlier, I think we first have to have a clear understanding of the normal. So only if you understand, for instance, in a country what kind of conflict events happen, how often certain protests or human rights violations occur over time, can you have some sort of a sense of which kind of fluctuations are normal and which are perhaps anormal. So from kind of more quantitative perspective, without a theory of the normal and continuity, you can't have a theory of change. I think certainly in the early stages of a crisis, I'm slightly skeptical of doing away with experts, and I'm also, I must say, a bit skeptical about Tetlock's research design around, showing that experts are basically wrong, or not better than chance. I think particularly in the early stages of a crisis, trusted authoritative experts are the ones that policymakers actually listen to. And we've just seen the report coming out from the two UK parliamentary committees who was really critical of the reliance on modeling and data. And they were saying that this reliance on modeling and data meant that the UK was later in locking down and taking decisive action. And what they should have done is they should have gone to people on the grassroots level in the countries that had already experienced the crisis and listened to those experts and asked them, what have you experienced? What do you think we should be doing? And they should have applied a precautionary principle. So certainly at the beginning of a crisis, it is you will not have the data. Very often you don't have the data to underpin any kind of drastic change, but you will need to exercise some judgment and listen to the experts that have it. The experts often feel it intuitively that something is different. Certainly, country experts sense a change because they're living there. They know it without necessarily having the data to show it. So I think it's partly about that interplay between individual experts and data to bring out those to show when something happens that is different than before. And that bring that to the fore, I think. And perhaps the last point, it's not just about understanding, I suppose, change and kind of emerging crisis. Certainly when it comes to Arab Spring or the rise of terrorist groups, it's about understanding vulnerabilities. So it is about understanding why these regimes are vulnerable to change. And I think that was actually quite well understood by some of the experts. It's just that they couldn't just say when they would fall. But the vulnerabilities, the underlying vulnerabilities were actually quite well understood. And I think that is already a first change to being better prepared, thinking about contingencies and so forth. So you don't necessarily need always to predict. I think just understanding vulnerabilities could take you a long way. Thank you.
Thank you. So okay, believe in experts is back. In fact, we're going to have a whole panel on the experts. So I want to sort of steer away from that, but this is already input for that panel. The intuition of experts. We've seen plenty of that, at least in this country. I'm not sure if I'm all too excited about that, but we can certainly we'll definitely get back to that. I like that idea of the theory of the normal, which then implies a theory of deviation from the normal. And that almost brings us back to the old-fashioned system theory. And when do we see a sort of random walk from normality sort of across the boundaries, if you will? And what are those boundaries? I think that's what you're referring to. And that's a very exciting research challenge. But let's say that we would have really, really good experts in Jordan, Dr. Alshoubaki. Would that have made a difference? I mean, would the policymakers in Jordan have actually paid attention if experts would have pointed out how big COVID was going to be? And you're still looking at immigration crisis, water crisis, and all the other crises you briefly mentioned there going on forever. Do you think that would have made a real impression if somebody said, I have this intuition that this is going to be big? Would that work in terms of the politics of attention that Dr. Pralle was just talking about here? What do you think?
Thank you so much. I think, considering the political situation in Jordan and all that stuff, In case of some experts alarming about the situation and the degree of complexity of, for example, the pandemic or any potential crisis, I think sometimes the government think about the cost of dealing with the problem or the crisis or the small or minor events. And if they're gonna ask, what if this prediction of expert is inaccurate, or the cost of dealing with it is greater than, for example, handling it after the or at expense of other problem. This one issue. It's also it's like my personal view, and it's about the policymakers in Jordan. They prefer to deal with the issues when there is a visible solution for it. So the visibility of solutions, the cost of dealing with the small events on Jordanian government, and sometimes the non-linearity of issues that will hinder the Jordanian policymakers from dealing with the small events based on experts alarming or consultation.
Yeah, thank you for throwing in that term non-linearity, because I think that is also crucial in this discussion. Before I hand over, I'm literally going to hand over the microphone to Mark. I know we have a question coming from virtual space, and there might be. So I have a very bad view here of the audience, but we have. I want to remind the audience. We have Katrina. Can you wave again, Katrina? Katrina would love to put a microphone in your face. So, please, if you have a question, don't look at me. It's not going to happen. Look at Katrina, because pretty soon I'm going to go to Katrina, and then we're going to line up those questions. So the order is Mark is going to take over, and then Henry is going to throw me us a question, not me, but the audience. The panelists from virtual space, and then by that time, Katrina has a few questions. Go ahead, Mark.
What a great discussion. There's a lot of questions popping up. I mean, we're talking about, if we break it down a bit, we're talking about detection, and we're talking about attention, and then we're talking about action. Officially speaking, 3 categories we could divide. But, I mean, on the detection front, just 2 quick reflections. I was, again, really spurred by this, by the presentations. On the detection front, what's our expectations? What do we expect? I mean, how far in advance should we be able to see warning signs? Because if creeping crisis is the kind of animating concept here, which is supposed to jog our thinking, I mean, should we have seen these developments taking place way earlier in wet markets in Wuhan, or even earlier than that, in environmental degradation that led to the spread of viruses that got into animals, which then got into wet markets in Wuhan, which then created this novel virus. I mean, what's the expectation that we should have of how far in advance we should see these things coming, knowing what Sarah said is there's already lots of noise out there, and the press cycle is short, and political attentions are limited as well. So expectations on detection, I think, is one question to throw out there. The other thing has to do with this attention-action relationship. Again, Sarah pointed it out, flipping it on its head. We have this young woman named Greta Thunberg in Sweden who has been very keen to call this a crisis, to say, and policies are beginning to discuss climate change as a crisis. But when you do linearity and you say there's attention and then there's a response, you can at least kind of try to see at what point does one tip into the other. Enough attention leads to a response. It's kind of easy to conceptualize. But you're right, of course. In reality, they're symbiotic. A little bit of policy, a little bit of attention, a little bit of attention, a little more policy, more attention. But at what point can we answer this question that's on the agenda, calling it a crisis? At what point can we call it a crisis? And have we, for instance, called climate change a crisis? Are we there yet? What's the threshold for calling it a crisis? What's the threshold for detection? I'm personally doubtful that we're really treating climate change as a crisis, but I think it's fascinating that people are trying much in the way you describe. So just some thoughts to throw out before we get Do you want to do the audience question next?
Let's collect a few questions, and then we'll divide them up again. And so we have this is our experiment with the hybrid, and we have somebody who's going to be beamed in here, and so Henry, who's going to do this? Are you going to bring sir, you can introduce yourself and ask your question.
Am I the sir in this scenario? Hi, I'm Paul Kearney. So I'm a prof over at Stirling. So actually, I think this is just a restatement of a question just asked. But I suppose I'd like to know from the panelists what reference point do we have in terms of good timing? You know, what would have been a good response that we can compare with all these bad responses? So, I mean, I'll talk about the UK later. I think that's, you know, going down as, you know, a bad response. But for example, the timing, I think in March was quite similar to timing in New Zealand, for example, which was an example of a really good response. You know, so what sort of factors are we bringing in to say that, you know, this was timely detection and action and this wasn't?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. So on the question of timely detection, there is one more question over here, but I don't know if you have a microphone, so maybe we could run one over there. Perfect. Great. I got that message. Here it comes.
Thank you very much. I'm Wolfgang Seibel from the University of Constance in Germany. And I was very struck by what Sarah told us here about wildfires and flood and the phenomenon of insufficient flood mapping due to what at the surface is, as I take it, or kind of underperformance, you could also call it, however, lack of institutional integrity after all, because, I mean, these authorities, I understand, are under pressure not to indicate, not to declare certain areas as being threatened by floods due to the fact that they anticipate that it has detrimental consequences, financial detrimental consequences for the people living there. And this, I think, is a pretty generalizable phenomenon because, I mean, authorities are acting under the tension between what by the way, I called in my own contribution here, the tension between responsibility and responsiveness. So they, of course, try to be responsive to their immediate clientele. At the same time, they have to assume basically responsibility according to what the legal prescriptions are and what their professional ethos should be, and they are acting under this particular dilemma. I do think this is a pretty generalizable phenomenon.
Can I respond to that?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's really interesting because there's a tension kind of between the experts who are the floodplain managers and the people that are drawing in, you know, the scientists who are determining the actual, or what they say is the actual flood risk, and then the local politicians who are subject to these other political pressures of trying to, you know, keep flood zones pretty narrow and save people insurance money. And so this is a case where you do have the experts who I think are willing and want to plan ahead, and but they're often going up against politicians, and the local politicians I found in my own work is often then get the national, federal representatives and legislators involved too, to kind of put the brakes on some of this, on some of these kind of more proactive flood policies, I would say. So it's a really bipartisan thing too, which is very interesting because in the United States there's not much bipartisanship anymore, as you know. But there is pressure on both Democrats and Republicans to kind of ease the insurance burdens on people. And so whenever the federal government has tried to actually make the rates more actuarial and to actually communicate risk through the pricing of the insurance, because right now it's subsidized, there is huge, tremendous political pushback So this is a case where you do, I think, have experts who are trying to indicate that there's a problem, but the politicians are kind of acting under, different incentive structure. So.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thanks, Wolfgang, for the question. There's another question here, but we might be accumulating questions at a pace which will outstrip our panelists' ability to answer them. Is it okay if we take we let the panelists respond and then get to the next basket of questions? Maybe we get back to that first question of our expectations. Paul brought it up as well. What do we? How far back should we expect, or how far in advance, I should say, should we be able to see the warning signs? I mean, knowing that there's always someone somewhere who sees a warning sign, but also when it's not just a person alerting, it's also knowing what we know about ecological processes and interweaving with human processes. Anyway, how far in advance? What are our expectations should we have? Any panelists want to take that one on? I see Christoph. Go ahead, Christoph.
Yes, I think the obvious question, the obvious answer is that it varies, and it depends on the instruments of preparedness and prevention that you have at your disposal and the lead time that is needed to actually make those policies work. So if you need a certain lead time to activate, track, trace, and isolate infection cases, you need to do that at a time when the system can actually still cope with the cases. If there are too many cases, the system won't cope. If you're looking at an asteroid approaching Earth, you want to do that, you want to detect that at a time where you can still launch some sort of whatever preventive measures you have at your disposal. So I think that goes back to my initial comment. You need to design detection and warning independence of your instruments for preparedness and prevention. Second point, I think it's not a question of one single point in time when you call a crisis or when you warn about it. It is about, there is something, let's look at it more closely. And in intelligence studies, that's something that quite often happens. You see something that's maybe unusual. You don't necessarily say, that's a big problem, we warn about it. It's saying, let's devote some additional resources to look at this phenomenon a little bit more closely, right? And then you kind of keep monitoring, and you keep also thinking about worst case scenarios so that you're looking at potential plausible paths to more or less desirable scenarios. And therefore you can look in a more focused and more well-resourced way at potential early signs of a crisis. I think the second question is, who do we mean, who do we expect to detect? Is it the experts? Is it the scientists? Or is it the decision makers? And I think we need to have slightly different expectations towards these two different groups of actors. So, for instance, on the question whether the UK has locked down too early or too late, I think there is a question over what was the balance of scientific advice that governments received. And did they ignore that advice? So, for instance, why did the UK ignore WHO recommendations on public health measures that were in February? And why did they act later than other countries? And of course, we know now, and it's in the report, that locking down a week later costs many ten thousands of deaths. So what is our expectation? I think there the question of hindsight bias comes in, but also the question of what was the balance of expert opinion, what was the level of, I suppose, uncertainty of data, and also what is it that we can expect from a political system at any point in time in terms of being distracted perhaps from other crises? What is really realistic? In terms of receptivity of decision makers, how can we judge that? So I think there's an issue of how do you design the science policy system so that good advice is given, and how do you take into account hindsight bias and consider different factors that could either lower expectations or increase expectations of decision makers to act early.
Thank you, Christoph. More thoughts from the panel on the expectations question? Or the when do we call it a crisis? Some are obviously obvious. I think a major conflict in Roos's case is okay. Well, when a missile hits us in the head, we know that something is happening. There's no need to subjectively construct that. Antimicrobial resistance. We wrote a book on creeping crisis where we had a lot of different chapters on different kinds. And to me, that's the perfect example of when do we call this a crisis. I mean, the evidence is clear that this is going to result in huge problems. It already does. There's precursor events, there's occasional indicators, but there's going to be something much bigger down the road. When do we call this a crisis? I see Eric zooming in. Is that a question you had, Eric, or?
Well, I put one in the chat, and then I was asked to turn on my screen, so I assume yes.
That's what you get.
But hello from Melbourne. Still locked down here for another few days. Well, I suppose I guess I'm really curious about, creeping crisis, and that's part of why I'm sort of tuning in. And I have a little bit of trouble quite understanding whether COVID is a creeping crisis, I suppose. I mean, I happen to know a little bit about infectious disease control, and just in terms of the issues you were mentioning, zoonotic diseases, which is basically the interaction between wildlife or domesticated animals and humans, and then the wet markets in China. These issues have been known in the global health security and global health community since at least 1997, when there was an outbreak of the H5N1 avian flu in Hong Kong. And the marriage of 9/11 and influenza created a massive boom in investment in preparedness for pandemics. So really, the idea that this is a new or somehow creeping event is interesting to me, because I don't really see that. I mean, there's a huge infrastructure globally around infectious disease control and around pandemics. I think what happened actually is that COVID was the agent rather than influenza. So if it had been a new flu that broke out in China, because by the way, also the focus was on China all the time. So what were the surprises here, really? The big surprise was that it was COVID and not influenza. Everything else was known and anticipated, which is also why each country actually was very, very fast to respond with massive modeling exercises. But they were modeling flu, and that was the baseline. So I wonder what was creeping about this crisis, and I'm wondering is 1997 not an early enough warning? I mean, is that too late to detect the creeping crisis? Anyway, that was my provocation coming out of this, I think there is something in this infectious disease case and infectious disease in general that is important to figure out, because clearly there were surprises, and clearly, a lot of the crisis sort of expectations that we will be surprised came true, despite all that preparation and despite all that early warning.
Thank you.
So yeah, I guess I didn't really end it with a question. I'm sorry, that was more like a comment.
No, this is great, because it's, thank you, Eric. Lockdown still in Melbourne, can you believe it?
I have a couple thoughts on this kind of detection issue and like when to call it a crisis. And I also do think it varies and it's hard. In retrospect, it's easy to see, but I think like when you have to sort of think to the future to understand whether it's going to be a crisis. So you have to be able to see those early signs and project, I think. And when you project, are you projecting in a way that kind of, where the costs keep ramping up, or the problem just is going to compound itself over time, and it's become sort of almost not irreversible, but almost irreversible, right? So I'm thinking of like pesticide use, when we sort of detected some of the problems with pesticide use, and there were early indicators, but they were in kind of random bureaucracies that weren't very powerful bureaucracies in the United States. And then it took someone like Rachel Carson to kind of tell a narrative about the future, right? It's like, what might happen if we don't address these poisons in our environment? And she painted a pretty bleak picture for people. And again, there's this sort of path dependency with that crisis and with things like biodiversity and climate change, where you keep going down that path of using agricultural pesticides and it just becomes harder and harder to switch paths. And I think that that is a way for me to think about why we should be able to try to understand those types of issues that are path dependent and that become very difficult then to solve if you wait too long. But again, it's not always, Rachel Carson was able to tell that story in a really compelling way and bring together all these indicators that no one had brought together before. And I think that's why she was successful to some extent.
So Sarah, you're essentially saying, you may have a theory, but framing is also very important. Telling a story, making people believe, and Eric is essentially saying we do have that theory. I mean, this was the most predictable crisis ever, if you will. We wrote, edited a book where we have several cases where the future crises are. We already wrote them down, so nobody can say that we didn't see them coming. In any event, it's not going to make a difference. But this will bring us to an issue of timing of intervention. I think timing is going to be something to think about, because when then in the theory, when do you intervene? We have a panel on that, as a sort of fuzzy gambling, which then I think leads us to the idea of the precautionary principle. It was already mentioned today, because we do remember the case of the Italian scientists who failed to warn for an earthquake, if that is even possible, and then were jailed, if I got it correctly. But we have Italian experts here in the room. So there can even be a danger to this whole detection thing and warning thing. And I see we have Amy all the way from Canada. This is so much fun, this hybrid conferencing. And I know we have questions. Katrina, very patient with her microphone, so rest assured that has been noted. So first we go to Canada, and then we go back here to Leiden. So Amy, welcome. 2 o'clock in the morning,
yeah.
Is that right?
Thank you very much, Arjen.
Amy cannot sleep in her bed, and sitting in her basement, I happen to know, with a wonderful background. Hi, Amy.
I fake it all. It's dark out here. We had a windstorm earlier that got the Dutch news focusing on California, but we had lots of wind here too. With people do make that connection. I was really enjoying the part about forest fires, about like low pressure and how that might be climate change, but that's going to be later on. My question was actually to the whole panel. I was going to raise it to Arjen and Mark, but I think Eric from Melbourne has managed to put the whole thing in perspective. And it's about this time frame, right? So Arjen, you started off saying all these waves, and can you predict the waves, right? You can miss the first and then you get the second. And we've seen some countries that did well in the first, did worse in the second, and so on. And so there'll be some data modeling about the achievement in the one, maybe closing your eyes to the next, or the other way around. But I think it comes back to what most panelists were talking about, and that's whether the timing matters in terms of what we see as a crisis. So how long or short can something be to be a crisis? And I think when Sarah was talking about how some problems with like flood lines and so on, can you say that something is a crisis when you know it's going to be a much longer period? And I think the whole COVID crisis, so to say, is it a crisis? Also, the question is what is the attention that we can have for something to still remain a crisis, or will it be a perpetual state at some point? And in a sense, maybe some of these wave problems that we've been seeing in countries is that they just can't make the population be in this sort of state of exceptionalism for longer than a certain time. So then it's convenient to kind of wish it away for a little bit of time. And then it kind of comes up, because obviously if you wish it away, people's behavior changes and you need the changed behavior. But do you need it changed forever or for a longer time, or is there a new normal, and what does that mean? So very long-winded way to ask, I think, all panelists, and kind of spring on the questions that we've heard previous questioners and discussants, not just the regular speakers, are also having reached on. So the question about timing: how long is a crisis? When does it stop being a crisis but a perpetual state, or is it a new normal? What does that mean? Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And I'm going to let the panelists, including Mark, think about who's going to take this question, and I'll collect a question. Katrina, will you? Yes. Giliberto.
Good morning. I'm Giliberto Cappano, University of Bologna. I have no question. I have a small comment for the panel here, trying to connect what I have heard about forecasting, international relations, and the concept of precursor event. If I have got what is going on in your field, substantially, as in other fields, you can predict only what is predictable, because you base the structural model on specific data, and then you have to, there should be something happened in the past. Means that it's okay. This is empirical evidence, and if you can predict only what is predictable, you know what I mean. We are here discussing what is unexpected. For example, we perfectly know that the Vesuvio, that is the volcano in Naples, will erupt, will have a big explosion in the future. We do not know when. So we cannot predict when, but we should try to be prepared to deal with this. So I think that we should try to think that predictions are important, but probably it's more important to think in terms to be prepared to deal with something that could be unexpected. And this allows me to connect to the precursor, the concept of precursor event. It's not a question directly to you, Sarah, but in this moment, statistically speaking, there could be, in every policy field, in every country, a lot of small anomalies that not necessarily will produce a big break, a big crisis. We have shorter turbulences, short anomalies for 2 days, 3 days, and then. So the real problem is that it's quite difficult to detect the right precursor event, and we again are back to the same problem we have. For example, what happened okay, we are here because of the COVID. On the 23rd of January, last year, 2020, I was sitting in Paris because I was there for 1 month, drinking my aperitif around 6 p.m. while the Chinese government was closing Wuhan. That one was not a precursor event, that was something nobody. If you pay attention, the first week of January, the people in Hong Kong, against the governmental will, they immediately started to wear masks. They heard the news from mainland China, as they call it, or they were used to call it, and they immediately wear the mask. For them, I would say that news was kind of a precursor event. For us, was nothing. And after 3 weeks, they put in lockdown Wuhan, and for us it was nothing. So I think that we should try to theorize a bit better about the concept of precursor event. Thanks.
Thank you, Giliberto. And this reminds me of one of our senior colleagues in the field, Bengtsoen Deluge, always talks about the lack of imagination. So we're so stuck in the types of anomalies that we've heard about and that we may fear or may have a discussion about that we simply cannot imagine, and there's a bit of exceptionalism coming there in as well. That happens in China, not going to happen here. So also interesting. I always love it when the Dutch talk about a smart lockdown, seemingly implying that other people are not so smart. So a bit of arrogance, if you will. So much to talk about. Many anomalies, they don't all cause a crisis. That brings us back to where Roos started, of course. And have you changed your mind on all? Or are you putting more trust in data? But maybe data is the way to tease out, which anomaly, if you will, has the potential to escalate.
Well, I put myself now in some sort of nerdy corner. Data says everything, and we can predict everything with data. This is, by the way, not entirely my corner, but I'm fine with defending this. So there were a lot of comments, and I thought first there was a comment concerning timing, long term, short term. How do we want to predict it, and for how far can we predict it? What we do know for conflict, in which the definition of crisis is basically how many dead people do we see, how hard this already sounds. This is really the case. So the definition is quite clear. What we do see in the nerdy field of data is that we can predict a conflict on a very short term. So in 2 or 3 years, our predictions are relatively good. We have also now predictions running that are maximum 30 years. So what happens in 2050 or so? And we do see that is very insecure. We cannot be sure. Then, even if we predict that there might be a conflict in a particular area, then the question is what to do with it. And I think especially the data scholars are a bit uncomfortable with that. So we publish this in academic journals. It's picked up sometimes by NGOs and IGOs. But we are a bit, this is not our field, because we don't actually know what to do with this information, so that should be picked up. And even if you know that there is in a region that there is a chance that there will be conflict taking place, what to do basically, because all these vulnerabilities that might increase the likelihood of conflict are not so easy to solve. Yes, there are grievances. Some people have no money, or they are living next to potential water disaster cases. It's not so easy to solve. So we need long-term predictions, because crucial issues, and that takes time to solve, basically. And then from the professor behind, concerning these what I call trigger events, or these small events, these anomalies. Yes, that is extremely difficult to figure out, and I think with the increase of the use of social media, where we can actually see that certain trigger events might cause a lot of uproar online, we are maybe able to basically tease out which trigger events might increase conflict. But as you perfectly explained it, it's extremely difficult to figure out which trigger event is blowing up the entire business, basically. We can do larger trends, but the tiny impact of these trigger events is still important. It's still difficult.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, just quickly, we have one question from Dr. Olivier Rubin about false alarms. He would like to ask the panelists, where experts attempt to detect a creeping crisis, how would it turn out wrong, or at least in the mark of, say, a population bomb, peak oil prices, or indeed COVID virus? What happens when there's false alarms in these instances? And then just another quick thing, Christoph would like to make a point after that.
Maybe I can just sort of add on that a little bit. So my point was that we focus maybe a lot on the type 1 errors. That is like a crisis we hadn't detected. But I guess there are also like type 2 errors where we think of a crisis, or thought there would be a crisis, and we would find out that we were actually wrong. And here it's not so much the corona, it was the H1N1 in 2009, right? And that might also be why the WHO was a little bit apprehensive this time around to sort of acknowledge that it was a big crisis, because they burned their hands a little bit last time, where it wasn't really a huge crisis. And just to very, very briefly comment, I like creeping crisis, but I think it's also important that it's
temporarily defined, which means that the spatial dimension is sort of getting lost. And we see that with, for instance, HIV/AIDS, which is still, I guess, a crisis in large parts of the world, but not in all, and not to the extent that it was in the 80s. So, like, how do we sort of incorporate the spatial dimension? So you might see that there are creeping crises in different parts of the world, low income and middle income countries and so on. And then a point to the sort of data-driven optimism. I mean, I guess like, so the financial markets, we see crises a lot, right? And there we really have a lot of, AI, like, it's data-driven to the point where I can't really comprehend it. So that might be sort of a cautionary tale in how much we should rely on big data.
And that is our friend from Denmark, and we're going to see him on one of the panels later on. So this is great. We're going to let many cross-panel insights already. And as we're slowly winding down this panel, Mark is going to pick up on the question of Amy. Then I'll throw one more question out, and then I think we're kind of on this, and then we have one more question there, and we're going to kind of go, because we need to go to the coffee and all that and prepare for next panel. So, Mark.
So be quick, that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
I get it. I think this is a wonderful discussion because in many respects the whole point of the creeping crisis concept was to generate these questions, actually, wasn't it? And I'm going back to Eric and to Amy's question. So Eric, I mean, actually, the lack of surprise is a fundamental underpinning of the creeping crisis concept. I mean, we should probably make it clear that creeping crisis. Oh, I need to turn it on.
I can hear you.
Arya can hear me. I'm sorry. So it's important to make clear, creeping crisis is challenging almost every component of the traditional crisis management concept, right? Which treats crisis as something that surprises us, that has to be dealt with relatively urgently, where decision-making, has to take place under very specific conditions of uncertainty, but, decisions made. And then the crisis subsides, the public moves on, and leaders go back to where they were. I mean, we're kind of challenging that on every count. So we know that these crises exist. That's part of the whole point of the creeping crisis. I perhaps admit that retaining the crisis terminology is confusing, I think, to some people. I can understand that for sure. But they're known. We know these things are percolating. We know they're fermenting. We know they actually are very, very serious. So they're not a surprise in that case. And so COVID is not a surprise in the sense, as Eric has done terrific research on zoonotics. We know, zoonotics are a problem, and this is just one of many. And in fact, COVID, we've had a lot of debates within our own group. Is COVID the creeping crisis, or is COVID the precursor event, or the indicator event, or the manifestation of a deeper problem in the world? And to Amy's question about how long and such, another aspect of creeping crises are not isolated events. They expand over time, and they are connected in two ways. Either the crisis we see at the moment is an indicator of something deeper, as I just mentioned, or, and Roos brought this up, and Jose will bring it up in the next panel, they are part of a cascade of different kinds of crises. I think that's one thing that today has clarified with the help of our presenters, is the different kinds of precursor events, what they might look like. They're not just indicators of a deeper thing, they can also be part of this powder keg phenomenon or a cascade phenomenon. So 2 quick responses.
Thank you, Mark. And we have Katrina. Yes.
Yeah, Jörg Raab, Tilburg University. I wanted to follow up what a colleague from Italy said, and also Eric, in terms of the precursor events. I mean, we've had a lot of precursor events in the public health issues. And on paper, the countries were very well prepared, right? If you look at US number 1, Netherlands number 3 or 4. We did study with the Dutch CDC on a scenario study of an outbreak of the new coronavirus in the Netherlands since 2016. So this was not a surprise. But then still you get sort of 2 or 3, 4 events or characteristics that throws the whole thing out of the window, right? So if you hear a Dutch epidemiologist talk why they missed the January outbreak that the colleague just mentioned, is it seems that the cognitive frame was pre-asymptomatic transmission must not happen, right? Even though they knew it could, but also if you hear Van Dissel, the Dutch infectious disease czar, so to speak, it was outside sort of this imagination that this could actually happen. But if we have our, on paper, well prepared for such a crisis, I mean, what does that mean for other crises? For example, in cyberspace, we now see there are a lot of precursor events, right? The pipeline in the US, shutting down companies in the Netherlands, hostage taking. And still, I think the cognitive framing is as such that that electricity will sort of fall out for a week will not happen, right? So in terms of understanding the cognitive framing and that little things, and I think that comes back to the predictability might happen that throws out all our preparations, I think that's pretty humbling.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great point. You know, we had Sarah introduce the notion of, you know, we should have a conversation about risk, and but how informed can that conversation be if you don't never experience risk? You know, what are you talking about? And in a country like Holland, of course, we would have a very different conversation about risk than, for instance, in a country like Jordan. And so I want to kind of give Dr. Alshoubaki the last word on this. Dr. Meyer said we have to learn from other countries. And that seems, you know, it seems so logical that it doesn't need to be stated, but apparently it does need to be stated, as we're already finding out. And that's, we're always so focused here on explaining to Jordan what they can learn from us. So let's turn this question around, and what can we learn from Jordan, a country that has to deal with many, you know, many types of crisis, creeping crisis, vastly under-resourced country in comparison to ours, and in your memo, the way you described how Jordan dealt with COVID, I have to admit, Jordan didn't do a whole lot worse than Holland did, and so that just begs the question. So let's hear some optimistic news and get some lessons from Jordan.
Okay, thank you, Professor. When we look to the Jordan situation, it's completely impacted by the political and social and economic conditions of it, of course. It tries to respond to the pandemic in particular, but if we want to know better about or to the lesson learned from the Jordanian government capacity to deal with the crisis, I would like to shed a light on the Jordanian government experience on dealing of other kind of crisis. I'm not going to say the pandemic itself, but I'm going to say that the Jordanian government succeeded in dealing with the spillover effect of the Arab Spring, for example, for fighting the terrorism in Jordan and around its border also. It's tried to also to stop the civil unrest or the potential transmission of civil unrest in Syria. Jordan tried to manage very quick governmental reform during this kind of political crisis. Jordan tried to fight, to collaborate with the world community to fight terrorism all over the world, and particularly in Syria, Iraq, and so on. What also comes to my mind that Jordan also tried to manage to deal with the humanitarian issues, for example, receiving refugees, dealing with other world problems with more focus and emphasis. But unfortunately, I'm not going to say that. It's like we can learn a lot from the Jordanian experience in the pandemic, because even when they try to manage like very strict health measures and so on. It's like Jordan suffered from economic repercussions of these policies. For example, the full lockdown negatively impacted it. Also, the online learning, it's completely collapsed. We cannot say it's very a successful experience. But in general, Jordan is capable to deal with the political crisis, and to put it in a very simple way, because generally authoritarian states, they prefer to control, to keep their power, so they defend it very good, unlike other crises.
Well, so I guess the news is mixed, but thank you so much. I want to thank all panelists for sharing their insights with us, and it was a real pleasure to have you, all four of you, have you with us. Of course, time is always too short to share everything, but there are memos, and those memos provide a gateway to the research behind the memos, so which is really cool, and very exciting research, so thank you.